Well, hello, and welcome to your weekly dose of higher consciousness. I'm your happy host and trumpeter of truth, Liz Garcia, and I've created this podcast and videocast to help you raise your level of consciousness by understanding levels of consciousness, putting it all into context, and learning how to let go of the lower levels of consciousness running within your energy field. And today, I promised we'd talk about one of the major levels of consciousness. And I thought it was neutrality, but I already did that. So if you're hoping to see the teachings of Dr. Hawkins' level of neutrality, you can find that on another episode, probably 4 episodes back. But today, we're going to talk about the level of consciousness of willingness, which calibrates at 310 on the map of consciousness. And this is a powerhouse, and this is a go-to level of consciousness to help you shift. And we'll talk about that later in this broadcast. So as many of you know who are following me on your weekly dose of higher consciousness, I start off every week with 101 ways to happiness. And Dr. Hawkins has a book called The Book of Slides, which was actually put together by students of his after he passed. And he has 101 ways to happiness. So every week, I've got 2 years worth of content on 101 ways to happiness. So this week we're on 101 ways to happiness number 16. And what is suggested is that you let go of clutching and grasping. And this is something we all do. We want to hold on to something. We want to control the outcome of something. We want things to go one way or another. And this resistance to allowing something that you want to come in is kind of what he's talking about. When you stop resisting or like having concern that things aren't going to go your way, if you don't hold on super tight, is a common problem. And the folks at Law of Attraction, Esther and Jerry Hicks and Teachings of Abraham talk about this as well, because there's an underlying energy running that's negatively oriented, that's suggesting, you're not enough, you'll have bitterness and resentment going on, whatever those lower level energies are. You got to learn to let go of holding on to anything. And I am a bit of a clairvoyant, and if you don't know what a clairvoyant is, it's someone who is able to see out of the third eye right here, right on your forehead, between your 2 eyes, just up on the forehead. And what that's like is typically I'll get visions in the morning or at night when I'm just going to sleep, because I'm kind of falling into sleep and I'm allowing messages to come to me. And what happens is I get this flash of an image, which like tells an entire story. It's kind of a powerful, intuitive tool to open up to. And we all have the ability to open up into clairvoyance. So I had a vision and the vision that I had was giving me a message of an eagle's talons holding on to something like a ticket. It was like holding on to it looked like the ticket like from a restaurant, like from an order book. And the talons were holding so tight. I got the message. You've got to let go, and you're definitely not going to get anywhere you want to go when you're holding on to something so tightly. So the weekly dose of higher consciousness is intended to help you learn how to let go of clutching and grasping and be free. And I've told the story before about I stepped into freedom, or the energy field of neutrality, as a teenager. I didn't know what I was doing, but I observed the energy shift, so to speak. I wouldn't even call it an energy shift back then, but I just knew I stepped into freedom when I was willing to let go of battling it out with my mother. Each one of us had to be right. Each one of us were going to clutch and grasp. But I finally said, you win, and I let it go. And it wasn't me losing it all, because I stepped into freedom. It was like freeing. I'm like, oh. And I tried to teach my mother how significant it was to let go of having to be right or hold on to anything or control anything. And she wasn't hearing it from me, so that's okay. but it's incredibly freeing to step into the energy field of neutrality. And if it's okay if it happens, and it's okay if it doesn't. So that's a good practice. Like, it's okay if it happens, it's okay if it doesn't. Let go of the resistance of thinking you have the control resistance. It's super freeing. I highly recommend it. So that's number 16 on the 101 Ways to Happiness in Dr. Hawkins' advanced teachings on raising your level of consciousness. Now, next up in our video cast is I love to share a weekly dose of higher consciousness quiz. And I give you 3 things to consider. And this week we're looking at the ancient Greek philosophers of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. They are all of higher consciousness, of course. But who is of the highest consciousness? And this is super interesting. They're on the map of consciousness, they're a quantum leap between each other, because, when you get up into those higher realms, 1 point is a quantum because it's a logarithmic scale. So 400 on the map of consciousness is 10 to the 400th power, whereas 500 is 10 to the 500th power. So that's, if you know your log, that's huge. You got to multiply 10, as you multiply one number by 10, by 10, by 10, it just gets huge. So that's our weekly dose of higher consciousness quiz, and I'm going to tell you the answer at the end of this. So now we're going to get to today's topic, which is the consciousness level of willingness. And I have some of all of this information is coming from the teachings of Dr. David R. Hawkins, and you can find who did research into consciousness. He spent decades. He's a huge gift to this world, in case you don't know, to have done the research into consciousness to help us put into context where truth is. Where does true power exist? What is not true, or what holds no truth? And what's interesting is when you do consciousness calibrations, everything below 200 on the map of consciousness holds no truth, essentially. And I'm going to do a whole podcast on what the heck does that mean, as opposed to being false, right? It's not that it's false, it just holds no truth, which is a different kind of feeling. So we're going to talk about willingness today, which is 310 on the map of consciousness. And if you've been listening in, you know that I like to use the processes in other levels of consciousness to kind of juice up my affirmations and juice up my understanding of how I can move through, let go of the lower levels and move into higher levels of consciousness. So I'm going to read from Dr. Hawkins' book, Letting Go, The Pathway to Surrender. Just a very short sentence on willingness. So willingness, this energy subserves survival by virtue of a positive attitude that welcomes all expressions of life. It is friendly, helpful, wants to assist, and seeks to be of service. So when we're talking about levels of consciousness, it's really just an energy level. Like, how much juice is in this level of consciousness to light up friendliness? Like, this is where friendliness and being of service, this is the energy level. So I want you to start to get into the feeling like it's a different energy, and you really kind of connect with it, the mind, that it's an energy, it's a source of energy. That's it. It's as simple as that. This source of energy, can it light a light bulb? Can it light an appliance? Can it run a car? Like, that's kind of what I want you to, use it as a metaphor. Like, energy, this energy has a lot of power. It can light more than a light bulb, that's for sure. So on Dr. Hawkins' Map of Consciousness, there's 6 columns. And I'll just hold this up for people that are looking. And this is and I recommend, the book of slides is really for more advanced spiritual students. But Power versus Force is really the book that you want to have on hand. I would recommend that for your spiritual library. Excuse me while I try to get organized here. So I highly recommend Power versus Force. That's his original book, talking about the science of consciousness research and how it all came about. And and a lot of people don't get it because it's of higher consciousness, for one thing. And there's a lot of scientific stuff going on there, which I recommend you use it kind of like at the beginning, use it like an oracle. If you start to read it and you're struggling, just say, you know what, life, I always just say life, God, whatever you want to call a higher consciousness. My intention is to open to the page in the book that I'm going to get today. What do I need to read today? And use it in that way until you start to kind of align with the energies of it and understanding of levels of consciousness. It's an abstract thing for sure. And abstraction is a high level of consciousness of the mind, which is where our philosophers are at and higher today. The philosophers are all calibrating very high levels of the mind, and there's one that calibrates at the highest in the spiritual domain. So there's 6 columns. One of the columns is simply the name of the level. So today we're looking at willingness. And then the log column is that it calibrates at 310, which is 10 to 310th power. And then excuse me, I better drink some water. So what's interesting about each level of consciousness is there's something called a process going on at this energy level. And the process at the level of willingness is intention. And I love that the understanding how powerful intention is. And Dr. Wayne Dyer, who wrote all about intention, knew intuitively about intention decades ago when he started writing about it. And I was watching a YouTube video with Oprah and Gary Zukav, and they were talking about intention. And it was really interesting that Oprah said that she started every show setting intentions for the show, setting intentions for her guests, asking her guests what their intentions are for the outcome of the show, and really lining up the energies for something incredible. So if you take a look at Oprah's life, huge manifester, that's a very significant discipline to set intentions every day for everything. So if you want to manifest big time, using the power of intention seemed to help Oprah. Of course, we're all a mixed bag of consciousness. So Oprah's got stuff going on that you and I don't, and you've got stuff going on that Oprah doesn't, So have that understanding, but still, willingness is a power play. And setting intentions really is a power play, especially when you start to let go of the grasping and clutching of lower levels of consciousness. And if you're wondering how to do that, I think it's episode 10. I talk through how to let go of lower levels of consciousness and what I've observed about it. Because it's hard to grasp. It's definitely abstract. So I talk through what I've experienced, and I've shared some other episodes, like how to let go of depression that came upon me. I'm like, all right, this is a great teacher, learning how to let go of depression, which I'm not chronically depressed, but I've had depression and despair. And I share that. So it's an excellent practice to shift through levels of consciousness quickly. And it's been highly effective for me and others. Okay, so intention, I just want to point that out again. Intention is an incredible process. Use it. Anywhere you can use intention, use it. It's an incredible process, and Oprah is living proof of that, among others. Okay. Next up, on the level of willingness, there's a column called emotion. Like, what's the emotion going on at the level of willingness? And the emotion here is optimism, which is like, wow. If you're naturally optimistic or generally optimistic, you've got willingness already running within you. If you're not, if you're negative aspect oriented, then you've got some letting go work to do, which, there's letting go. When you start to let go, it's it becomes easier to be optimistic. You just are, because you're removing the blocks to the optimism and that's already running within you. The optimism and inner joy is already there. The energy's just blocking it, negative aspect oriented stuff. So if you're optimistic on any particular subject, you're running the energy of willingness on that subject. Now, the other two columns that are of interest are the self-view. How do you view yourself? And I did a whole episode on self-view because it's really super interesting to ask yourself, contemplate, how do I view myself? What's the first thing that comes to mind, right? Something will come to mind. And then I found there may be the first thing that came to mind could be something negatively oriented. But then as you kind of sit with it, you're like, I'm not that way. And something else comes to mind. So at the level of willingness, are you hopeful? Hopeful is a powerful level of consciousness, to be hopeful at 310. And if you view yourself as hopeful, then that's positive aspect oriented and powerful. Now, hopeful, there's other ways to be that are more powerful, and that would be faithful. If you're faithful is a quantum leap in power from 310 at hopeful, faithful is 365. So I myself am working with the energy of faithful and saying, I am faithful, because I've let go a lot of negativity, and it's not hard for me to say it. I can still feel some resistance to it and doubt, but it's stronger than it ever was. So I'm like, I use the mind and my understanding of true power and say, and I am faithful more than hope. I'm hopeful and faithful, but I like to bring it into my awareness that I choose to be faithful because I understand the power of that. And that power helps to dissolve the lower levels, the fabric of the lower levels running within you. So hopeful is still a powerful way of being. And a lot of people are not hopeful. So it's something to work towards, to aspire towards. Having hope is constructive and worth your attention. And the last column is God view. And again, I did a whole episode just on God view, and I asked the same questions of the listeners right off the bat. What's your God view? How do you view God? And your answer to that will indicate a level of consciousness that you're operating from on that particular topic. And when I first heard this, the first thing that came to mind was punishing for whatever reason. But then I thought about it. I'm like, God's not punishing. That's not true. I knew it wasn't true, but it was running within me. So I had to take a look at it. Where does that coming from? To think that God is punishing is coming from energy of guilt. So there's guilt running within me and all of us that would kind of create the energy of that God view. So that's not my view anymore. But at the level of willingness, your God view is that God is inspiring. So that's a healthy, true level of consciousness to be operating from. And I found my God view changes. I'm all over the higher map now, the higher realms on my God view, because God is all of that: inspiring, merciful, wise, loving, one, all being. Those are the higher levels. So willingness is this week's. We'll take a look at this week's, and it's a great level of consciousness to aspire to. Now, I want to put all of this into context, and this is not to discourage you at all, but only 85% of the planet calibrates at 200 or below. 50% of the United States calibrates at 200 or below. So we all have work. We're all part of the mass consciousness of the planet and our countries that we live in. So you got to be willing to accept you're not necessarily, you're running low vibrations on some topics. You're likely running high vibrations on other topics, and you're somewhere in the middle in your level of consciousness. And Dr. Hawkins has calibrated that most of the people that attend his lectures are running in the mid 300s or so. And 350, which we'll talk about in a month, is a level of acceptance where you're willing to accept you're the creator of your own experience. So spiritual aspirants are willing to take responsibility for the way they feel, the way they act, their own level of consciousness. So if that provides some hope for you. Well, I have people on two ends. Some people think they're at the low end. Others think they're super high. I'm like, if you were super high, you wouldn't be watching this right now. The high levels of consciousness are a phenomena beyond human imagination. And to reach the level of 540, as an example, you're stepping into inner joy and unconditional love, which is rare on this planet. So that's kind of putting it all into context. But you can run inner joy on occasion. You can feel it and you can intend for it. You can intend to step into inner joy and be willing to release the blocks to it. That's my own work I have to do. I have experienced inner joy and the opposite of it. So now I have this like kind of fear going on that if I experience inner joy, it's going to bring on something I don't want. So I have to work. I'm working through that. And my affirmation is I'm willing to step into the courage. I'm willing to step into courage on removing the blocks to inner joy. That's my affirmation. Okay, so I wanted to read some ways of being around this level of 300 and 310. So to be idealistic calibrates at 295. To be orderly calibrates at 300. To be fair calibrates at 305. To be normal calibrates at 300. To be ethical calibrates at 305. And these are all what Dr. Hawkins would call the virtues or spiritual foundations. These way of beings are virtues and spiritual foundations. And I've found that some of these ways of being I am, and some of these ways of being I am not. So it's an opportunity to kind of shore up the bricks in the foundation. If some of these you're not, that's just one piece of the foundation that needs a brick to kind of shore it up. Okay. To be ethical is 305. To be respectful is 305. To be balanced is 305. And to be glad is a quantum leap kind of from willingness is 335. I mean, the linear mind's like, oh, that's not a big leap, but in energy level, it is because it's a log from 10 to the 310th power to 10 to the 335th power. So a great exercise this week is to choose one of those. Like what way of being can I could stand to, shore up as an example. And maybe you could stand to be more respectful to others. That's a level of consciousness of 305. And maybe there's one person you really don't respect that could use a little loving, and let go of the clutching and the grasping and the need to be disrespectful to anybody. So an affirmation for this could be, I'm willing to release the need to be disrespectful to anyone and let go of that. I'm willing to do this. And as you say it, you can feel the energy loosen up. I'm willing to release the need to be disrespectful towards anyone. Or normal. I'm willing to be normal. I'm willing to let go of things that are loony and just be normal. Because we all have this like loony belief about ourselves, probably, Most of our negatively oriented thoughts, many of them are turned right back on ourselves. So it's a good idea to let go of the need to think loony things about yourself because it isn't true, and just be willing to be normal. So that's the affirmation. I'm willing to be normal. And willingness, as you know, is a high power of consciousness to use in your affirmations. And I also like to recommend understanding. Understanding is the emotion at the level of consciousness of 400. So I like to use different power levels in my affirmations. So I would use, I understand. I understand it's powerful to be normal. and I'm willing to let go of lower levels of consciousness. Or I understand it's powerful to be respectful to others, and I'm willing to release the need to be disrespectful to anyone. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And there actually is, it's of a higher level of consciousness to be aware that you want to say something disrespectful or not nice about somebody and stop yourself from doing it and release the need to do that, because the willingness to not say something that isn't nice calibrates at a pretty high level. It's in the 300s. I couldn't find the calibration number, but let go of the need to say anything mean. It doesn't serve you or anybody else. So that's it for this week's teachings of Dr. Hawkins' level of consciousness of willingness. Now we're going to go back to the quiz to give you the answers to the quiz. So let me find my cheat sheet on the levels of consciousness of who do you think is of highest consciousness? And these were all ancient Greek philosophers. Is it Aristotle, Plato, or Socrates? So Aristotle calibrates at 498 in the map of consciousness. Genius level consciousness is typically 499, so that's still a quantum leap. 498 to 499 is still a quantum leap in power, but he's up near the genius level, and that's how I just assume that he is because of his, historical significance. So Aristotle calibrated at 498 on the map of consciousness. Plato calibrated at 485 on the map of consciousness, which is a quantum leap away from the genius level, but clearly he was genius. It was genius of his time. And the 400s is all the level of consciousness of the mind. This is all reason, rationality, science, understanding. Socrates is of the highest consciousness in this week's quiz. And Socrates calibrated at 540 on the map of consciousness, which is a quantum leap above the other two, and in the realm of the level of consciousness of joy and unconditional love. Now, this is huge because he understood love and unconditional love at this level. And there's only 0.4% of today's population that ever reaches this level of consciousness. So it's huge, and all three of them are worthy reads and worthy to understand all of them. But Socrates understands love, and he's of the highest consciousness. If you want to learn more about Socrates and everything that he had to say. And as I was looking at this, there was a quote, I think it was Aristotle, who said something about love, like love didn't make any sense to him. I forget the quote. Let me see if I can find the quote, because it's kind of indicative of someone who is kind of enamored with the mind, for sure, and hasn't been exposed to the truth of the power inherent in the level of consciousness of love and unconditional love. So let me just look at this. What was that quote? I have it right here. Let me take a second while I launch the website. Here it comes. Let's see who said that and what they said, but it was kind of interesting that one of these guys said it. Okay, it wasn't Aristotle, and it definitely wasn't Socrates, so it had to have been Plato. Plato said, love is a serious mental disease. Okay. He was clearly not operating. Let's see, Plato was the lowest level of consciousness here. So he was not of low consciousness, but he's a quantum leap below the level of love at 485. So it's way out, it's like a light years away from his awareness, knowing that love is the truth, where true power really exists. And the fact that he thinks it's a mental disease is kind of funny. That would calibrate as not true. that love is a mental disease. Unless, of course, you're operating from lower levels of consciousness where you're clinging and holding on to what you think is love, what's really not love. You're holding, grasping onto something that you think fulfills a need or whatever. When you're operating from true love, that doesn't happen anymore. I can assure you. I've been there on occasion. I'm working on it still. I still have my issues, but anyway, I know it's not a mental disease. It's funny. All right. So I promise you guys at the end of every broadcast, love is the truth. And even though it's not in your awareness, it's light years away from most people's awareness, which is why you don't know it's the truth. But it's an incredibly powerful level of consciousness to aspire to be loving, unconditionally loving and joyful. Don't should all over yourself about it though. You got to let go of the lower, and the rest, and the highers will reveal itself in its own good time. You don't want to force any of it, especially because that's kind of like you're punishing yourself for not being unconditionally loving. Don't do that, because experiences will show up in your life that are punishing. Take it from me. You don't want to invite punishment because you think you should be loving. Dr. Hawkins will say the same thing. Be willing to let go of the resistance to lovingness. Be willing to accept that love is the truth. That's a good starter kit. I'm willing to accept that love is the truth, and I understand that it's a high level of consciousness. I'm just not there yet. That could be your affirmation, right? Acceptance. You're accepting you're not there yet. That's okay. We're only human. All right. So I'm not sure what next week podcast will bring. I never do, even though I have it scheduled. Let me look. Let me see what I'm thinking I'm going to do next week. Let's see what we got going on. Willingness. Oh, we're going to talk about the processes of emotions at each level of consciousness. So that's a good one. We'll talk about emotions and what that all means at different levels of consciousness. All right. And then the week after that, I'm going to talk about how to let go of anger. Ooh, that could be good. Or I'm going to talk about pets. Having a pet is huge. I might talk about pets, lighten it up with something fun. Talk about the level of consciousness of animals and our household pets. If you don't have a pet, I'd recommend you have one, unless you're anger-ridden and rageful. Don't get a pet. You might want to hurt it. You don't want to do that. So if you're enjoying what's going on here, subscribe to my podcast at trumpeteroftruthradio.com. Or if you prefer the video version, you can go to YouTube or trumpeteroftruth.tv.com. And I'd love to get feedback and comments if this is helpful or useful. Should I keep doing it? That's up to you guys. Although, I'm eager to raise the level of consciousness of our planet to neutral. That's kind of my overarching intention. See, I'm setting intention here, folks. Neutral. Our planet currently calibrates at 207 on the map of consciousness. Neutral would be 250, which is a quantum leap, and I can't do it alone, so I need some help with that. But I think neutral, just by the name alone, is the energy level of the planet, could really clean up a lot of stuff. But we all got to contribute to that intention. Thanks for joining me. You can email me at liz@trumpeteroftruth.com. And we'll see you next week. Sayonara.